In today's episode, we're asking the questions, what should I expect in a typical animation production workflow? What kind of feedback should we be giving at each stage? And should we skip out on our great jokes? Stay tuned and find out.
Welcome back. My name is Will.
My name is Kathryn.
And this is Behind the Pixel, an Open Pixel podcast. The podcast where we try to bridge the knowledge gap between those who buy creative content and those who make it. What do you like to make? Do you have a hobby of making things?
Not yet. I really want to get into pottery. Specifically, I want to try raku firing because that looks super cool. So, what about you?
Sleeping, maybe?
As a hobby?
Yeah, I feel like there's it could be like a world tournament champions of sleep.
Ooh.
Yeah, that'd be a great reality TV show.
It'd also be a great
show.
Side Olympics competition.
Who can sleep through the Olympics longer?
For sure. But why don't we start by talking about a bit of business that we have?
Yeah, just a quick reminder. So if you have a question, a topic, a thing you want us to cover on the podcast, please go to openpixelstudios.com/pod question. Submit your questions there. Again, it doesn't sign you up to anything. It just tells us what you are thinking about and what kinds of questions you might have. Another thing is I just had a talk with UC Denver.
Nice.
I talked to the students there. I gave a little background on me, on the company, I gave some advice. It was a really neat conversation. And so that's going to be another episode that drops. Please listen, check it out.
A bonus. Exciting.
Bonus episode, super bonus.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll jump into today's topic at least because there's a lot to cover. So we are talking about what an animation production workflow looks like, and especially how to speak the language of animation, but just a little bit.
Just a little bit. Just a little bit.
A-N-I-M-N. It's a...
Are you going to spell animation?
It doesn't work. I see. All right. Well, that fails. So before we go too far off track, I guess, why don't we get into the problem?
Yes. Let's describe the problem. So on the marketing and communication side, the problem that is happening here might change based on what your relationship is to the content. So depending on how you're thinking about this, if you've never made an animated video before, so if you're in that position, you may not fully understand the workflow at all. And that could be intimidating. It could be something new to jump into. Is always, kind of exciting, but also scary.
Yeah.
If you've used animation before, you might have seen that different creatives have different approaches to some of the same stuff. They have different workflows that can be sort of frustrating or confusing, especially if you're working with multiple types of creatives, because it's hard to know which one is the right way of doing something, which could make it hard to sort of let go and just trust their workflow. And one last problem might be that you aren't aware that other workflows exist. You might just not be aware of it. Yeah. So you're being guided through an approach that may be making the project actually more difficult to accomplish.
There's got to be a better way.
So your project could be taking longer because your creatives are maybe skipping steps within the workflow because you're trying to hit a deadline, maybe not knowing that some of those steps shouldn't be skipped, Ideally, yeah. Do you skip stuff?
What do you mean?
I don't know. Do you skip to my Lou?
That's a reference I haven't heard in a long time.
Moms like you choose skip. I'm a huge skipper.
Wow.
They call me Skip Tracy.
Skip Tracy.
Okay, those are all my skip puns.
All right, yeah, and I think at this point we should skip this jokes.
Ooh, nice.
Right.
So what's the problem on the creative side?
Sure. Okay. So on the creative side, a couple things are happening. The first is that sometimes you might not have a client side or client facing presentation or an infrastructure on how you're going to deliver your deliverables. Or if you haven't broken your workflow down into steps or stages yet, it can be very quick to feel pretty disorganized about the whole thing.
Yeah.
So that's one frustration. Another problem is when you're working together on a creative team. There might be some assumed definitions that for some of the terms that we all know and use within that established workflow for a project. And what happens as a result is that it gets confusing between teammates if we have different ideas of that definition. So a great example is like the term asset. I might know what that means coming from a video game background. You might have a different definition from your visual effects background.
I consider some other things assets that you don't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's a little confusing. On top of all of that, if you're going one step above, if you're a leader on a creative team, you might expect different responsibilities from a specific role that's going to be different than what the creative is already anticipating that role to be. So you might not be on the same page with your own creatives. An example is like one role at one studio might be completely different in terms of the responsibility, the expectation, the job description.
But they might share the same title.
Right, exactly. So what's happening as a result is that collectively we are making it harder for the people who buy that creative content to follow along with our different workflows, roles, responsibilities. So ultimately, both the terms and the roles within the project could use better definitions overall. A great example is like, what do you define as like an art tech? What is that?
Art tech?
Art tech.
That's a role?
It has been for me.
That's not like software, like artistic tech.
Oh, like tech for artists.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
I don't know, Midjourney is art tech.
Right. No, not exactly. Right. For me, it meant like I was working a little bit sometimes in art and a little bit in tech.
Sometimes
I did
in
some
tech.
programming. I did some
okay.
artistic work, but it wasn't very clear all the time.
Got it.
So I think we need to get to a better place of clarity. So why don't we start by providing some definitions for folks so we can get on the same page?
Absolutely. Okay. So the first term we used just now was workflow. And I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what that means.
Right.
So
what's that?
Some people might describe this as a process, a procedure. Some people, like us, we describe it as a creative pipeline. In animation, there are certain steps or stages that must be sequentially completed. Mm-hmm. If you do any of them out of sequence, you might run into some production problems.
For sure.
So,
yeah. Then within that as well, there's this idea, which we also think already mentioned, but there's steps, stages, or phases. They can all mean the same thing. It's ultimately one section or a part of the workflow overall. So when you put all of the sections together, you're creating your production workflow through steps, stages, or phases.
Yeah. Another term that we used a little while ago was deliverable or milestone, or some folks call it reviews. So these are all documents. They could be files. They could be elements. They're really just presented or presentations at specific stages of the workflow. So it's a chance to get a peek at what's going on behind the scenes before you move forward. Typically, they're associated with a deadline and require your feedback, right? So it's at a point where we can't move forward unless we see something and we agree on what that something is. And then we can move forward. So that's deliverable, milestone, review, any one of those.
Yeah, it almost feels like when you're playing like an old arcade game and like you just lost at a certain particular point and a pop-up box comes up and it's asking you that question of like, continue? Like,
yeah, so in The Last of Us, they were talking Mortal Kombat 2, I think, is what they're playing.
Yeah.
Hopefully no spoilers here. But I remember once you die, you're like, continue?
Right.
And it's like a 10.
And 9. And the stress of that, 8, of like you drop
7,
your quarters and you're
6,
like, oh no, I gotta go,
5,
and you're frustratingly trying to put
3,
the quarters back in.
2.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, you hate to see that.
All right,
yeah. So to not give anybody any stress, why don't we start assigning some roles?
Yeah. What do you got?
So I think today I will assume the role of the marketer.
Okay. And I'll be the creative.
Yeah. So we're talking about, as always, we're each giving our own point of view about this problem, sort of where it's coming from. So for me, depending on the project that we're working on, I'm basically looking to give my input, right? I'm trying to check in on the project, and I'm trying to make sure that everything is on schedule according to our plan. Maybe that's a schedule that we set up together and we collaboratively collaborated on, as one does. Or maybe that's something that you gave me. You set up the schedule and the expectation. But overall, I'm really just trying to ensure that the outcomes of the work is meeting my expectations. And so a question comes up throughout that process. Like, what is my role really? Am I serving as a boss in this case? Am I serving as like an equal partner? I'm not really sure how to define my role within the different types of projects that we're working on. So ultimately, I want to be able to give my input to you, but I might not know how to collaborate on each of those steps or stages that are coming through. And every place I go to is showing me a different way of working through that workflow. And how my input is going to be used is also different. So I'm kind of in this weird place where I feel like it's like Groundhog Day. I'm like in a movie where I keep entering Zoom calls with animation studios and freelancers, and I'm like learning. I know what happened already. Like I know some terms, but then you've changed up the terms for me, and like the workflow's different. And I feel like I'm just going through this nightmare of like everything's different all the time.
Got never-ending Zoom calls. That's a different
nightmare. Zoom fatigue is real. But yeah, so that's what's happening for me. But what's happening on your side?
So on the creative side, because animation requires multiple steps, I'm usually presenting only one part or one piece of that entire workflow at a time. And that presentation might be a rough version that requires iterations before moving forward. And sometimes it's frustrating that clients really can't bridge that visual gap from seeing a rough draft of something to sort of imagining what the final version is, right? Mm-hmm. So consequently, I might not be getting the right kind of feedback at each stage of the production that I need to sort of reach your strategic goals, right? An example is I'm getting questions about, say, motion at the concept stage, or I'm getting script changes at the point of animation, or I'm getting model changes after sort of a character design has already been approved. Like those are all places where I'm frustrated because there might be a disconnect between what you're telling me and what I can actually do within the production at that moment. So all that contributes to the same sort of feelings and similar situations. I need to clarify what I need from you at a very specific stage of the production. And I want you to understand why I need that type of feedback and what type of feedback I need at that particular moment.
See, I feel like as a marketer, I'm also frustrated because I'm like, why do I need your feedback? I want to know. You know what I mean? Like it's like,
wow.
All right. As a quick side note, we like to like rewrite songs pretty often. So
we're the Weird Al of today.
No, well, Weird Al is today still.
I guess that's true.
Yeah, I think it's more.
He's still pretty amazing. We love you, Weird Al.
Absolutely. Yeah. Come help us write weird marketing animation songs.
Yeah, that's weird.
It's so niche.
All right, before you invite us to your next karaoke night,
please do.
Let's talk about solutions. So what kind of provided solutions can we give
fair enough. So yeah, I think one of the main things is that on both sides, we each need to establish what our roles are going to be on a per project basis, right? This will change over time, depending on what project you're working on. But you need to decide what your levels of impact are going to be in that creative process. So for example, on the marketing side, like, am I a creative thought leader in this process? Maybe I'm serving more as a creative director or a creative advisor. Those could be different things. Or maybe I'm just somebody that's going to approve yes or no and then send it upstairs, as we're calling it. Yeah.
So stamp on it.
Yeah, for sure. So, and especially on the marketing side here, a piece of advice we have is to ask the creatives that you hire for an explanation about their workflow. Sometimes they're going to tell you this through a Zoom call that you're on or just a regular phone call. Yeah. We don't mind phone calls. Or they'll send you an infographic or a video. On the flip side of that, honestly, they might not actually give you any information at all, in which case I would consider that a pretty big red flag.
Big red flag.
Yeah. But you want to think about how many people are going to need or want creative control of the content that's being made on your side.
Right, that could be more than one person.
Yeah.
Usually upstairs too. It's like
Right. So that's kind of what's happening on marketing for sure.
Yeah. On the creative side, so a solution might be to create a list of guiding feedback questions for your client at every stage. This is happening all up and down the industry where we're saying this is the type of feedback we want at this point right now. And that's cool that people are doing that more. That way they know what to look for so that they can give you feedback. So, you get what you need at that particular moment in time. And then the other part of it is just to define your workflow clearly and sort of non-technically. I think that's a really big. Sometimes creatives get into their mindset of like, we need to do it this way, create it like technically. But when you're presenting, it's a whole other ballgame for who's looking at it. So in that case, you want to assume the client knows nothing about your workflow, right?
You're going to hear this multiple times today.
So set the expectation for what the deliverable is. Here's what you're going to see, and here's what we need from you.
Right, right. So naturally, as we do, there's times where, we have a policy where we only send out our deliverables at, I want to say like 3:00 in the morning. And we have like, a 2-hour turnaround time for that feedback.
3 a.m., 2-hour turnaround.
Yeah, if you can get that back to me by 5 a.m., that'd be great. Thank you. Yeah.
Not a problem. No one does that here.
No, not at all. We're asleep, so don't call us.
So we've covered some very quick tips for you to put into practice, but, and that's nice. I'm not saying quick tips aren't nice, but let's get into the most common workflow for animation and what you should expect to see at each step and what you should give feedback on at those steps. So we're going to go a little bit deeper in here.
Yeah. Let's explain to the best of our ability.
Yeah.
We'll give it our all.
Let's give it our best here.
Yeah. So I will kick things off. Basically what happens is that most creative places are separating their production into these 3 parts. The first is pre-production, the second is production, and the third is post-production. Now, these terms are an attempt to draw lines between different types of work that happens within the production workflow, and they typically include different stages or a certain amount of stages within each of those groups. At our studio, we actually got rid of those terms because in our experience, like at the very least, pre-production is kind of that act of creating all of the both static and written elements that are needed to actually start the animation production. So it's prior to even animating, right? And the act of when we actually go to animate the video, that would be typically listed under the production category. But once all of the animation is done, you might need to do some extra things. You might need to tweak things a little bit to finalize that look and feel of the video. And that falls into the category of post-production. So just to give you a semblance overall of what that looks like.
Yeah, just to go back for a second, the reason we don't split it up this way anymore is because we've realized that it's really a binary thing. You're either working on the project or you're not. At
least for us. Yeah, it doesn't mean that one way is right or wrong, but we do want to just acknowledge that those 3 steps are still usually very important to the production.
And you might hear those still from other places.
For sure.
But in post-production, I think that's usually where you use most of your Post-it notes.
Boy. I guess, yeah, maybe.
Right? Or you start to post more on social media.
Right. All of the above of posting.
Or you eat more post cereal.
Oh, wow. Okay. Why don't you continue on in our workflow here?
You're a cereal poster.
Nice.
So
proud. He's so proud.
I'm so proud. In any production, big or small, you're going to most likely start once you're in production or in pre-production. You might start with a script. And the script stage is where you figure out what to say and why you're saying it. 2 big key
Very
components,
important.
Right? If you're working on a project with characters, this is where you're going to develop these characters. Give them a voice as to what they sound like and what they say. Not necessarily just yet what they look like. at least in our production workflow. In our workflow, the script stage is also where we generate something called an AV script, and that comes with visual ideas. So an AV script stands for audio visual script, and we're writing those sort of two things at once. There are other types of scripts that we can get into. We're not going to get into those here. We're going to have a whole other episode on script writing and better ways to write scripts for animation. But the best way to give feedback at this stage is to evaluate the tone of voice for the overall messaging. If you're working with brand guidelines as a marketer, you can think of your brand voice as the guide for what this is. If you've never heard tone of voice, I don't think anyone listening should have. I mean, you
as
should
a marketer,
know
you probably know what it means. Yeah.
But so the key is you usually know what you want to say, and tone is how you say it.
Right.
So that's just the difference.
For sure.
The visual component of the script is where I think most marketers or communication people fall flat and need the most help, which is, by the way, totally fine.
That's good. I feel reassured.
You want to leave some space for doing some creative exploration here. So you might want to bring in a creative at this point, give them a sense of what you're trying to do. Here's what I want to say. Here's how I want to say it. What do you think visually we should bring in at this moment?
Right. It sounds to me like the creative is trying to like guide those ideas like a shepherd almost,
Yeah.
you know, going
You're like guiding those sheep to that shepherd's pie.
Oh no.
We're going to have minced lamb.
Shepherd's pie.
Sheep
That's
meat.
silly, but I'm moving forward. All right. So we've talked about scripts. So the next stage of our workflow is concepts. This is really a visual preview of what the final video will look like. I want to make a key note there that it's a preview of what the final will look like. Some production companies may have what's called like a visual development stage, or sometimes they call the stage style frames. It's not to say any of those terms are right or wrong.
Looked at is another term.
Yeah. It all kind of means the same thing. It's just a different approach to the same idea of showing that visual preview to the client. And so feedback at these stages is all about matching the visual direction to the tone, the message, and the goal of your piece, especially as you established it in the AV script. So some questions that you can think about when you're giving feedback at this stage are, do the visuals stick within your brand guidelines, or are they straying too far away for some reason? Or when you look at each element on the screen, is it accurately representing the intention behind the piece, right? There's goals and then there's intentions. There's all sorts of things
You
there.
never want your brand to be in tension with the piece.
Boy, we're having a punny day here.
It can be intense.
Man. The more size we can get from our audience with puns, the better. We're a pun-based studio. I hope I mentioned that already.
Before,
Yeah, I will say it again.
Once the look and feel is established, through the concepts, then we move on to something called storyboards. The storyboards are meant to depict the entire story from start to finish. How that is presented to you varies widely between studios and project to project, depending. Some will provide rough drawings that present the main story elements. Others, like ours, will present visuals following the format of the AV script. So in our workflow, the stage is the most critical for feedback.
Rephrase that again. It is the
in our workflow,
most.
This stage is the most critical for
I feel like
feedback.
there's like flashing lights going off or like sirens. Yeah.
It's where you make any final changes to the design, the objects, the characters you see on screen. When static elements or characters are set up to move, it can be very difficult and time-consuming to go back and make design changes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's true.
That's really the biggest issue is like, I've gone through this particular stage, I've gone through this process, and now I have to, either I'm starting to animate and you want to go back and change. Mm-hmm. And there are some tools and technologies that have been built around this exact problem.
Yes.
In different packages. Mm-hmm. So it's allowed some of that to be a little bit more flexible, but oftentimes that's the part that really creates that conflict.
Right.
So make sure you have confidently established the style and the story and the direction at this moment in time before moving forward.
So once you have a script, you've got your concepts, you've got your storyboards done, everything's feeling really good, this is where the animation production actually comes into play. And what begins this production is actually sound, which maybe we weren't thinking about. But this stage can happen at different points, which is a little confusing, but it's because it depends on how much sound is incorporated into your project and how much it's the driver. As an example of this, you can think about it like if you're using a music-driven video as your main goal for the piece here. The music is ultimately what comes first before anything kicks off. And it's where you're generating ideas from, it's where you're creating the story around, and it's what you're writing the script for to figure out the timing for the music. But if you're doing something like a narration-driven video, especially that requires hiring voiceover artists for, we believe that the dialogue should be recorded right in between that storyboard stage that we're talking about and the animation stage that we haven't talked about yet, so that animators have the dialogue to work with when they're starting to animate, right? Really important. And what happens at this stage as well is sometimes right before you go into animation, a studio will end up recording what's called a scratch track. That could be better. I think it's better than mine, because mine would be like, wicka, 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 you know, like, yeah. We got to work on that. We'll bring in a beatbox artist and figure it out. But yeah. So there are, but I wanted to acknowledge it's either a scratch track or temporary audio.
Right.
So yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so scratch tracks are temporary recordings that provide a sense of timing and pacing of an animated video. We find working with scratch tracks are valuable, but only really up to a certain point. You know, when you're working with scratch tracks, the animation, oftentimes the final audio is brought into the animation much later, which means that you might also need to retime the animation because of that change. So.
Right. And so sometimes this causes a situation where when you can think about retiming, you can also add this sub-stage that comes about, which we haven't talked about yet.
Bonus stage.
A bonus
unlocked.
There you go. Yeah. It's an additional stage. It usually happens within pre-production, and it's called an animatic. You might have heard the term before, but if not, we'll just explain it briefly. But an animatic takes the storyboard, those single images, those frames or panels, and times them out to an audio file, which is typically where this scratch track comes in. And we typically see this in more long-form productions, and usually they have like entertainment as the focus of the project, as opposed to what we talked about before, like education and selling, or the combo. Right. So yeah, I want to acknowledge that an animatic comes into play here.
Yeah. Giving feedback for sound can vary widely.
Yeah.
And it's a crucial element for moving a story forward, but giving the proper feedback sometimes is actually very difficult, and it's also depending on what you're looking for. It's so subjective. And so in this category, we have very little to give you. We'll give you some, but I think we're going to try to get someone on that will talk about giving feedback for sound.
For sure.
Because we know some sound folks. If you're having trouble giving feedback with sound, one of the things that we try to say is like, try removing any personal opinions around what you believe good sound and bad sound sounds like, right? Your personal preference, obviously, are going to be in there, but you try to stick to what they call the technical aspects of the sound, you know, focusing on certain instruments or certain key notes or certain areas of the piece. If it's voiceover feedback, if you're working with people speaking, try asking for different cadences of the same lines. So if I said something like this, or if I said something like this. I'm working on my VO career here.
Yeah, I was going to say side VO career.
There's so much to consider. So we're going to try to get someone on to talk about that. That's a whole other bag of worms.
Yeah.
We don't want to open too much, but that's the feedback that we can give.
I guess that's fair enough.
I don't think we're not sound people as much as
Hold on. How dare you? Do you know that I was in the marching band?
Oh wow.
Yes, and jazz band, and I think that was it. I think those are all.
Bands.
But I played the alto sax for 13 years. I know something about sound.
Okay.
Something.
You can read music.
Yeah,
I can't.
I can.
I can't read music.
Shout out to all the fellow bandos
My
out
dad
there.
is so disappointed that I can't really play an instrument. He's very disappointed.
You'll get there.
That's okay.
You got plenty of time.
So once the sound is in, to some capacity, whether temp or, final, now we can go and move on into animation. So
Yay.
in animation, there are only a few stages that you might come across that matter to the person who is giving feedback. And these stages for us fall into sort of two categories. The one category is sort of rough animation, and then the other category is final animation. In rough animation stages, you're typically looking at something that looks very bland, sometimes with very little color. Maybe it looks pretty terrible, honestly. And that should
true.
be expected. I think that's important. That should be expected, that it looks really bad. And it's because we're looking for we're looking to rough things in, put things in place so that we get a sense of it, but not the final sense of it. You know what I mean?
Right.
There are some awful expectations in there. So just like you need to chisel away at a rock to get to a final form, like a sculptor, right? You're kind of chipping away at that final thing. Animators need to put in some rough positions. They need to put in some rough placing, rough something. And then they'll go over it with a fine-tooth comb. So one thing to remember about animation is that it's an iterative medium. It requires more passes than just one pass. The first version is not going to be the best version.
That is the truth.
So this is where most, I think, marketer, strategy people, communications folks, business people, they get the most anxious. This is where that anxiety just drives up because it's not usually what you expect. Right.
I don't get what I'm looking at. Yeah.
So you, as that person, do you want to see the final as soon as possible? But that usually isn't the way it goes because we want your input before we move forward, right? If I show you something rough, is this roughly the path we should take? Or should we go in a different direction? So we don't want to put too much it's like not too many eggs in that basket. Let's change the basket. Let's look at this basket. That's not a good analogy.
Sure. Oh, it's fine. Keep going. You're fine.
Feeling like a basket case over here.
Boy, all right. Wow, we're just throwing them in now. We got
So some terms within the rough animation stages that may include something called previs. I think we talked about that. That stands for pre-visualization. It's visualizing scenes before you actually shoot. Usually this is a live action term, but before you shoot the film or do the actual production shooting, you want to pre-vis it out. Another term you might hear, layout. Basically, it's the same idea, roughing those positions, but for animation. When you see the layout of the animation, you're going to see the previs of the animation. Same idea. In layout, the type of animation that you're looking at is called blocking.
Right.
So you put those blocks in there, and that's rough animation pass for the animation, rough positions.
Right. Usually when it involves characters as well, you'll...
Definitely. And then something that we do here is called a motion test. A motion test usually is final motion for a very small sliver of the project. That way you get a sense of maybe it's a very important piece that needs to be sort of thought out more. That's a motion test. So final animation, final motion for that particular step.
Right. It'll basically guide and inform the rest of the motion for your entire piece.
Exactly. Feedback at rough animation stages is super specific to the project. But broadly speaking, the best advice we can give you would be to ask the production studio or ask the person you're working with, some creative, to clarify what they need. What kind of feedback are you looking for if you're in that position?
All right. So it makes me think a little bit about the idea, I need your thoughts, your ideas, your boots, and your motorcycle. Nice. You got it right.
You need to get to the chopper.
Oh, okay, good. I'm glad that came through.
All of the marketing terms are in the chopper.
We got to work on our impressions. We'll get there one day.
All right.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about final animation stages here because those usually include a lot of internal stages on the creative side that we won't get into here, but we'll visit them at a later point. But usually what's happening is that the studio is presenting something that you can easily digest to get a better sense of what the final piece will ultimately look like. So at our studio, the motion stage, as we call it, not necessarily the animation stage, it's where we expect to drive most of the creative direction for what we think looks good. And that's because of all the stages that we've done before that were based on your inputs, which means we get to go in there and we get to do our thing within the limitations that you've set already, which is super helpful. So the animation stage is really all about representing the culmination of the planning and all the work that was done prior, right? The 80% of the work goes into planning. And now it's all working together. So it's a beautiful harmony of the result of all these stages. Yeah. And so feedback at this final stage, I want to acknowledge here as well, another critical moment. It is the most dangerous place to give feedback. I want to say that again. At the animation stage, it is the most dangerous place to give feedback as a marketer. It's because, as we've already talked about, all the stages are linked together sequentially. And as a result, if you're changing a design later on at this final stage, you might end up needing to backtrack and double your work because now you have to go back through all the stages again to get to the point of animation. Yeah. And that ultimately is going to decrease your ROI on your project, which nobody wants to see.
You never want to go down on ROI.
Yeah. So the point here is that we cannot say this.
I
know. We cannot say this enough. We need, as a collective unit, to stop saying, let's fix this in post. It cannot happen anymore. Please stop saying, let's fix it in post.
Yeah, just eat more post cereal.
You're going back to post cereal. Sure.
Speaking of post, the post-production stage starts once all those stages are done. So once animation is done, then you go into post usually. This is typically where things get refined a bit. This can include sound effects. It can include color grading, which is basically fixing and finalizing the color across your piece. You can also have an effects pass, which may include some visual effects elements, VFX, visual effects. Those are things like smoke, water, buildings tumbling down. I mean, VFX gets really crazy. We're not going to get too much into that here, but it depends on what you're doing. We're probably going to have someone come in and talk about post processes, post-production feedback.
For sure.
The feedback in post-production, in our case, is almost non-existent because in our workflow, we have motion encompass all kinds of motion, including VFX motion. So we don't split that. But we'll try to get someone on to talk about post-production feedback and tell you guys about what that looks like.
Yeah, for sure. And so, okay, with all of that, that's about it for today. We know that was kind of long and sort of heavy in terms of the content that we're providing. But we honestly don't expect you to take away every single thing from this. You don't have to memorize everything. If you do take away anything at all, it should be to understand that the production workflow is pretty complex, and a lot goes into it. But if you keep an open mind about it and you have a good sense of your imagination throughout the process.
You gotta work on that.
Yeah.
More imagination.
Yeah, it's creative, right? Yeah. You will feel very well equipped to jump into an animated project. So that's what we want to empower you with.
Yeah. Here's the tease for the next episode. In the next episode, we're going to cover the most important terms that you'll need to follow along in that workflow conversation.
Right. Stay with us.
Lots of terms, lots of words.
Yeah. But in the meantime, a big, big thank you to eMedia for producing this podcast. Our producer is Jackson Foote, and our music was created by Hidden and licensed through premiumbeat.com. Yeah. And now it's time, as always, our favorite part. Until next time, stay honest.
Stay creative.
Stay open. See you in the next episode.
Thanks so much for listening.
Audio listeners, stick around for a bad idea.